The wind out here did not just blow, it hunted. It moved across the high plains of the Wyoming Territory like a living thing, seeking out the gaps in a man's coat and the cracks in his resolve. Elias Boone pulled his hat brim lower, squinting against the stinging grit that rode the gusts. He was 35 years old, though the land had carved lines into his face that made him look 10 years older. Now, before I tell you the rest of this story, I want you to settle in and get comfortable. This is a tale about second chances and about two broken people who found each other in the most unlikely of places. If you have ever felt like the world gave up on you, this story is for you. And I promise you, by the end of it, you will believe in redemption again. Elias sat atop his dun gelding, a sturdy animal named Rusty, and watched the fence line that marked the northern edge of his property. It was late November, the time of year when the sky turned the color of bruised iron and the ground froze hard enough to ring like an anvil under a hoof. He was a man built of hard angles and silence. His shoulders were broad from years of throwing hay and wrestling calves, but he carried himself with a quiet, watchful tension. A jagged white scar ran along the line of his jaw on the left side. It was a souvenir from a saloon fight in Kansas nearly a decade ago. That fight had ended with a man dead on the sawdust floor and Elias riding north, carrying a weight in his gut that no amount of whiskey or distance could dissolve. Since then, he had kept to himself. He built a small cattle spread in the shadow of the Absaroka Range, speaking only when necessary, which was rare. But today, the silence felt different. It felt heavy with expectation. Elias reached into the breast pocket of his sheepskin coat. His gloved fingers brushed against the thick folded paper there, ensuring it was still safe. It was a letter worn soft at the creases from being unfolded and read 100 times by the light of a kerosene lamp. The handwriting was neat, looping, and feminine. Margaret Hale, Maggie. He had placed the advertisement in a St. Louis newspaper 6 months ago, feeling like a fool the entire time he sat in the newspaper office dictating his simple request. Rancher seeking honest wife for partnership and home, solitary life, respect guaranteed. He had expected silence or perhaps scorn. Instead, he had received a letter from a seamstress in Chicago. She wrote that she was 28 years old, accustomed to hard work, and seeking a fresh start away from the city, smoke, and noise. She called herself no one special, a phrase that had tugged at something deep in Elias's chest. Today was the day she was supposed to arrive. He turned Rusty's head away from the wire and toward the distant smudge of gray that marked the town of Bitter Creek. "You are a fool, Elias," he muttered to himself, the words echoing the rhythm of the horse's gait. "A woman like that taking a chance on a man with a scarred face and a dirt floor cabin. She will take one look at you and get back on the stage." But the hope was a stubborn weed. He had scrubbed the cabin floor until his knuckles were raw. He had fixed the leak in the roof. He had even shaved that morning, the razor scraping over the scar and leaving his skin raw and stinging in the cold air. The ride to Bitter Creek took 3 hours. The town was little more than 2 rows of false-fronted buildings clinging to the edge of a muddy thoroughfare. It huddled against the vastness of the plains as if afraid of being swallowed whole. As Elias rode in, the smell of wood smoke and wet pine greeted him. A few horses stood hipshot at the hitching rails, tails flicking against the wind. He tied Rusty outside the livery and walked to the stage depot. The station master, a balding man named Silas, who chewed tobacco as if he were angry at it, gave Elias a nod. "She is due in 10 minutes, Silas said, spitting a stream of brown juice into the dust. "You look like you are going to a funeral, Boone. Fix your face." "I am just waiting," Elias said, his voice rough from disuse. He stood on the boardwalk, the wind whipping his duster around his legs. His heart hammered against his ribs in a frantic rhythm that shamed him. He checked his pocket watch. 2 o'clock. At 10 minutes past 2, the sound of thundering hooves and the creak of leather springs announced the stagecoach. It rolled into town, a layer of road dust coating its red paint. The 6 horses were lathered and blowing steam in the frigid air. The driver hauled back on the reins, the brake lever groaning as the heavy vehicle lurched to a halt in front of the station. Elias took a step forward, his hands sweating inside his leather gloves. The door swung open. A man in a bowler hat stepped out, carrying a heavy case. Then an older woman with a sour expression clutching a Bible. Then a salesman with a sample case. Elias waited. He watched the dark interior of the coach, expecting a hand to reach out, a skirt to brush the step. The driver jumped down and began unstrapping luggage from the boot. The passengers dispersed, heading for the hotel or the saloon. The door of the coach remained open, swinging slightly in the wind, revealing only empty leather seats. She was not there. Elias stood frozen. The noise of the town seemed to fade, replaced by a high ringing silence in his ears. He felt a profound sinking sensation, as if the boardwalk had suddenly turned to water beneath his boots. He walked over to the driver, a man named Holloway, who was dusting off his coat. "Was there another passenger?" Elias asked. His voice sounded calm, which surprised him. "A woman named Margaret Hale from Chicago." Holloway shook his head without looking up. "That is the lot of them, Boone. Picked them up in Cheyenne. Nobody else. She had not come." Of course she had not come. Why would she? She had likely taken the ticket money he sent and used it to move somewhere else. Or perhaps she had met someone in St. Louis, someone without a scar in a remote, lonely ranch. Or maybe she had simply come to her senses. Elias felt a hot flush of humiliation rise up his neck. He had told Silas, he had told the owner of the general store that he was expecting a wife. They would all know now. They would look at him with that pity that was worse than scorn. "That Boone fella," they would say, thinking he could buy happiness, thinking he was fit for decent company. He turned and walked away before anyone could see the look in his eyes. He needed a drink. The saloon was dim and smelled of stale beer and sawdust. Elias ordered a whiskey and took it to a table in the back, sitting with his back to the wall. He drank the burning liquid in one swallow and stared at the empty glass. The memory of the man he had killed in Kansas flickered in his mind. The sudden flash of the knife, the reflex of his own gun, the look of surprise on the boy's face as he fell. It was an accident of survival, but the guilt had never left him. He had thought foolishly that perhaps he had served his penance, that perhaps Margaret Hale was his chance to be something other than a killer and a recluse. "You deserve this," he thought bitterly. "You are alone because that is what you are meant to be." At the bar, 2 freight haulers were talking to an old scout named Jim. They were speaking in low, serious tones, but the saloon was quiet enough that their words drifted back to Elias. "I tell you it was a mess," the freighter was saying. "We passed the wreckage about 20 miles east of the cut. Wagons turned over, trunks smashed, looked like a devil of a storm caught them. Or maybe road agents, though I did not see any bullet holes." Jim shook his head, his long gray hair swaying. "It is the pass. The wind comes down off the granite peak like a hammer. If they tried to cross 3 days ago when that squall hit, they never stood a chance." Elias felt a cold prickle at the base of his spine. "Did you stop?" the bartender asked, while wiping a glass. "We looked," the freighter said. "Saw a couple of bodies frozen stiff. Looked like they had been there 2 days. We did not have shovels to bury them, and the ground is like iron. We brought the mail pouch, though. Found it near the lead wagon." Elias stood up. His chair scraped loudly against the floorboards. He walked over to the bar. "What wagon train?" Elias asked. The freighter turned, eyeing Elias warily. "Small outfit. 3 wagons coming up from the southern spur, trying to beat the snow to the settlement." Elias looked at the mail pouch sitting on the bar. It was unbuckled. "Who was on it?" Elias asked. The freighter shrugged. "A family named Jensen, a couple of drovers, and a woman traveling alone. I saw the manifest in the pocket of the trail boss." Elias reached out, his hand trembling slightly, and pulled the manifest from the pouch. It was a crumpled piece of paper stained with coffee and dirt. He scanned the list of names: Jensen, O'Malley, Kincaid, and there, near the bottom, M. Hale, destination Bitter Creek. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. His stomach dropped, a sensation like falling from a great height. She had not abandoned him. She had not taken his money and laughed. She had come. She had been out there on the trail coming to him. "She is dead," the freighter said matter-of-factly, seeing Elias's face. "Nobody survives 2 nights out there in the open, not with the temperature dropping like this." Elias looked up. The panic that had been a quiet hum in his chest roared into a deafening noise. "Where?" he demanded. "Where exactly?" "East of the Skeleton Ridge," the freighter said. "Near the dry creek bed that runs into the Powder. But listen, friend, you do not want to go out there. The wolves will be at them by now, and there is another storm rolling in tonight. You can see the clouds banking up over the peaks." "I have to go," Elias said. Jim grabbed his arm. His grip was like tangled wire. "Son, do not be a fool. If there were survivors, they are gone now, frozen or eaten. You ride out there now, and we will be thawing 2 bodies out come spring instead of 1. Elias looked at the old man's hand, then into his watery blue eyes. He saw the truth there. The land was indifferent. It ate the weak and the unlucky, and it did not give them back. But then he thought of the letter in his pocket. "I am no one special." He thought of her riding across half the country to meet a man she knew only by his jagged handwriting. She had come for him, and he was sitting here drinking whiskey while she was out there in the ice. He pulled his arm free. "I am going." The bartender slammed a glass down. "You are suicide-bound, Boone." Elias did not answer. He pushed through the swinging doors and into the street. The wind hit him instantly, colder now, smelling of coming snow. He went to the general store first. He bought extra cartridges for his Winchester rifle, a heavy wool blanket, a flask of brandy, and 5 pounds of jerked beef. He bought a coil of hemp rope and a lantern with extra oil. He moved with a mechanical efficiency, shutting down the part of his mind that screamed he was too late. He had to be moving. If he stopped moving, the grief would catch him. He mounted Rusty and turned the horse east, away from the ranch, away from safety, and toward the open, featureless plains. The town faded behind him, swallowed by the gray light. He rode for hours. The wind was a physical weight pushing against him. His fingers ached on the reins, the leather stiff with cold. He kept his eyes on the ground, looking for the ruts of the wagon trail which were barely visible under the dusting of old snow. Just as the last of the light was bleeding out of the sky, the storm broke for a moment. The clouds parted enough to let a strange, luminous twilight bathe the plains, and there he saw it. About half a mile ahead, the land dipped into a shallow ravine. In the bottom of the cut, dark shapes lay scattered like broken toys. Elias urged the tired horse into a gallop. The wreckage was a graveyard of ambition. 3 wagons lay in various states of destruction. One was tipped onto its side, the canvas cover shredded and flapping like a surrender flag. He dismounted and walked through the debris. He saw the first body, a man lying face down, half buried in a drift. He walked past him. He could not help the dead. "Margaret," he shouted. The wind swallowed his voice. Margaret. And then he saw a patch of blue. She was there, huddled in the lee of the broken wagon bed, partially pinned beneath a heavy wooden trunk. She was curled into a ball, her knees drawn up to her chest. Her hat was gone, and her dark hair was loose, matted with ice and dried blood where she had struck her temple. "Maggie," Elias choked out. He fell to his knees beside her. He touched her face. Her skin was terrifyingly cold, like marble. Her lips were blue. He pressed his fingers to her neck and waited. There, a faint flutter against his fingertips. A heartbeat. She was alive. Elias worked fast. He grabbed the heavy trunk that was pinning her legs and heaved with everything he had. The trunk slid back with a scrape of wood on rock. He gently pulled her free. She was limp in his arms. He pulled her onto his lap, shielding her body with his own against the wind. "Margaret," he said, shaking her gently. "Maggie, wake up." Her eyelids fluttered. They were heavy, crusted with snow. She opened them a slit. Her eyes were dark, unfocused, glassy with hypothermia. She looked through him, seeing things that were not there. "The train," she whispered, her voice a dry rasp, barely audible. "I missed the train." "No," Elias said, unbuttoning his sheepskin coat. "You are safe. I have you." "Elias," she breathed. He froze. She knew his name. She had been lying here freezing to death, thinking of the man she was coming to marry. "I am here," he said. He pulled her against his chest, wrapping the edges of his thick coat around her, trying to share his body heat. "I am Elias. I found you." She did not answer. Her eyes drifted shut again, and her head lolled against his shoulder. Elias looked up at the sky. The hole in the clouds was closing. The snow was coming back, heavier this time. Night had fully fallen. He could not stay here. If they stayed, they would both die. But riding back in the dark in a blizzard with an unconscious woman was madness. He looked at Maggie's face. It was pale and bruised, but strong. She had survived 2 days. She had held on. He stood up, lifting her in his arms. She was lighter than he expected. He carried her to Rusty and managed to get her into the saddle, holding her steady with one hand while he swung up behind her. He settled her in front of him, wrapping his heavy wool blanket around both of them. He took the rope from his saddlebag and tied it loosely around her waist and his own, binding them together so she would not fall if she passed out completely. He turned the horse's head back toward the west, into the teeth of the wind. "Let us go home," he said. The journey back was a blur of agony and endurance. The darkness was absolute, broken only by the white swirl of snow. Elias could not see the trail. He had to trust the horse's instinct and his own internal compass. Every jolt of the horse seemed to rattle Maggie's bones. Every few minutes she would whimper or gasp, a sound of pain that cut through Elias like a knife. "Stay with me," he murmured into her ear, his lips brushing her icy hair. "Do not sleep, Maggie. You hear me. We have warm coffee at the cabin. I have a fire laid. You just have to hold on." He told her about the ranch. He talked to keep her awake, to keep himself awake. He told her about the creek in the spring, about the way the light hit the barn in the morning. She drifted in and out. Once she thrashed against the rope, crying out about the cold. "I know," he soothed, tightening his arm around her. "I know it hurts, but you are not alone. I have you. I will not let you go." He had spent 10 years pushing people away, terrified of the violence in his own hands. Now those same hands were the only thing keeping this stranger alive. The cabin was a dark square against the lighter gray of the snow when they finally arrived. Elias slid from the saddle, his legs folded under him for a second, numb and stiff, before he caught himself against the horse's flank. He carried her inside and laid her on the narrow bed in the corner. He did not light the lamp yet. First the fire. He moved to the cast-iron stove with clumsy, fumbling urgency. His fingers were so stiff, he dropped the match twice before he managed to strike it. The flame flared and he fed it kindling, then larger logs, blowing on the embers until the stove began to roar and tick with expanding heat. Only then did he light the kerosene lamp on the table. The golden light washed over the room, revealing Maggie's face. She was pale as milk. Her breathing was shallow. She was soaking wet. The snow had melted against her clothes during the ride, and the hem of her dress was frozen stiff with mud and ice. Elias stood over her, his hands hovering. He was a bachelor who had lived alone for 10 years. He had never seen a woman in her undergarments, let alone undressed one. But if he left her in these wet clothes, she would die of lung fever before sunrise. "Forgive me, ma'am," he whispered to the unconscious woman. He began to work, his movements practical and swift, though his ears burned with a heat that had nothing to do with the stove. He unbuttoned her heavy traveling coat, peeling the sodden wool away from her arms. He turned his head away as he unhooked the back of her bodice, fixing his eyes on the rough-hewn logs of the wall. When the dress was loose, he pulled it down, sliding it over her hips and legs. He left her in her chemise and petticoats. He could not bring himself to go further. He grabbed every quilt he owned and piled them over her. He took off his own flannel shirt, which was dry and warm from his saddlebag, and managed to maneuver her arms into it, buttoning it to her chin. As he worked, he saw the bruises. They bloomed like dark violets across her ribs and along her upper arm. There was a nasty gash on her temple clotted with dried blood. He pulled a chair close to the bed and sat, watching her chest rise and fall. He did not sleep. He simply watched, acting as a sentry against the death that had tried to claim her. Maggie woke slowly, floating up from a dark, cold river into warmth. There was a smell of pine and coffee. She opened her eyes. Above her she saw rough timber beams stained with soot. This was not the wagon. This was not the boarding house in Chicago. She turned her head. A man was sitting in a chair, his head bowed, asleep. He was large, with broad shoulders and dark hair that curled over his collar. Panic seized her. The last thing she remembered clearly was the wagon tipping, the world spinning. She tried to sit up, but pain lanced through her ribs, sharp and breathless. A small cry escaped her lips. The man's head snapped up instantly. His eyes were dark and alert. He leaned forward, his big hands coming up as if to calm a startled horse. "Easy," he said. His voice was deep, rough, like gravel, but quiet. "You are safe." "Who are you?" she rasped. Her throat felt like it was full of glass. "Where am I?" "I am Elias," he said. "Elias Boone." The name floated in the air between them. Elias, the man from the letters. "You never came," he said gently. The stage arrived. but you were not on it. I went looking. Maggie stared at him, trying to align the image of this rugged, scarred man with the polite, distant words on the paper. You found me in the wreck, she said. You were pinned. I brought you home. Home. The word sounded strange. She looked around the cabin. It was small, tidy, and masculine. A rifle hung over the door. A saddle sat in the corner. She looked down at herself. She was wearing a man's flannel shirt, huge and enveloping. Her face flushed hot. My clothes, she whispered, clutching the quilt to her chin. They were wet, Elias said quickly, looking toward the fire. I had to get you warm. I turned my head, ma'am. I promise you. She saw the red creep up his neck past the white line of his collar. He was embarrassed. This man who looked like he could wrestle a steer to the ground was blushing because he had seen her in her petticoats. The fear in her chest uncoiled just a fraction. Thank you, she said softly. Rest now, Elias said, standing up. You are safe here. The door is barred. The fire is built. Nothing can get to you. The days that followed blurred into a rhythm of pain and healing. The blizzard raged outside, sealing the cabin in a tomb of white, but inside it was a small island of fragile safety. Elias became her nurse. It was a strange role for a man with hands the size of shovels, but he was surprisingly gentle. He boiled water on the stove, the steam filling the small room. He tore up an old clean sheet to make bandages. Maggie watched him through half-closed eyes as he cleaned the gash on her temple. His brow was furrowed in intense concentration, his breath held tight in his chest, his hands trembled slightly, not from weakness, but from the effort of being soft. Is it bad? She asked one evening, as he applied a poultice of herbs to her bruised shoulder. It will heal, he said. You will have a scar, maybe, but you are mending. He slept on a bedroll near the fire, giving her the only bed. At night she would hear the wind howling like a lost soul, tearing at the corners of the cabin. Far off, coyotes yipped and sang, a lonely, chilling sound that made her pull the quilts tighter. But then she would hear the stove tick as the metal cooled, or the soft rasp of Elias turning over in his sleep, and the terror of the wilderness would recede. They spoke little at first. The silence of the high plains seemed to have seeped into the cabin. But as her strength returned, the silence began to fill with halting words. She lay propped up on pillows he had fashioned from grain sacks, watching him mend a bridle by the light of the lamp. Why did you choose me? She asked suddenly. Elias looked up, the needle pausing in the leather. My letter, she said. It was short. I said I had no skills for ranching. I said I was plain. Why did you answer? Elias set the bridle down. He looked at his hands. You said you wanted a fresh start, he said. You said you were tired of noise. I reckoned I understood that. Maggie picked at the edge of the quilt. I was a seamstress in Chicago, she said. I worked in a room with 20 other women. No windows, just gaslight and dust. She paused, the memory tasting of soot and shame. I lived alone in a boarding house, she continued. A woman living alone. People talk. They assume things. My landlord, he was a man named Mr. Carroll. He thought because I had no father or husband, I was available. Elias went very still. His eyes were fixed on her face, dark and unreadable. He tried to force his way into my room one night, she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. I fought him off with a pair of fabric shears. I cut his arm. He told everyone I was a madwoman. He told my employer I was a thief, and worse. I lost my position. She looked up at Elias, her chin trembling. "I did not come here for adventure, Mr. Boone. I came because there was nowhere else to go, no one who would stand between me and the world. I sold everything I had for the train ticket." Elias looked at her for a long time. She expected judgment. She expected him to ask if she had encouraged the man as the police officer in Chicago had asked. Instead, he nodded slowly. "You are safe here, Maggie," he said. His use of her given name was unconscious, a slip. "If any man tries to force a door here, he will answer to me, and I do not miss." She saw the steel in his eyes, then a glimpse of something dangerous that lived beneath his quiet surface. It should have frightened her. Instead, it made her feel a fierce, warm gratitude that started in her chest and spread to her toes. He did not offer his own story that night. He turned back to the bridle, pulling the thread tight with a snap. But she saw the way his jaw worked, the way the scar stood out white against his skin. As the second week passed, the cabin began to feel smaller, or perhaps they were just filling it more. Maggie was well enough to sit at the table now. She wore her mended dress, which Elias had clumsily tried to wash for her. They ate stew made from dried beef and potatoes, sitting across from each other in the pool of lantern light. She began to notice things. She watched his hands as he broke bread. They were scarred, the knuckles swollen from work, but they moved with a deliberate grace. She noticed the way he checked the window every 10 minutes, a habit born of a man who lived with danger. Elias, in turn, watched her. He noticed the way her dark hair, which she tried to braid neatly, would always escape in tendrils that curled around her ears. He noticed the way she pressed her lips together into a thin line when her ribs ached, refusing to complain. One evening, while the fire crackled low, he told her the rest. "I am not a good man, Maggie," he said, staring into the flames. She looked up from her mending. "You saved my life," she said. "I took a life," he said. The silence that followed was heavy. She waited for him to continue. "It was 10 years ago in Kansas," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. "A saloon fight. A boy, barely 20. He pulled a knife. I was faster. I did not mean to kill him, but the gun went off." He touched the scar on his jaw. "His brother gave me this before I got out. He swore he would hunt me down. I get letters sometimes, posted from different towns, telling me he is coming. That is why I live out here. That is why I have no neighbors." He looked at her then, expecting to see revulsion. He saw only a deep, sorrowful understanding. "He attacked you," she said softly. "It does not change that he is dead," Elias said. "No," she agreed. "It does not. But it does not make you a monster, Elias. It makes you a man carrying a heavy stone." She reached across the table and covered his hand with hers. Her skin was warm, her fingers small against his scarred knuckles. "We all have ghosts," she said. "I have mine, you have yours. Maybe they can haunt each other and leave us be." Elias felt something loosen in his chest, a knot that had been pulled tight for a decade. He turned his hand over and squeezed her fingers. One night the wind rose to a shriek. The cabin groaned under the assault. Suddenly a violent gust caught the leather hinges of the shutter on the south window with a crack like a pistol shot. The shutter flew open, banging against the outer wall. Snow exploded into the room. "The shutter!" Elias yelled, leaping from his chair. He rushed to the window, struggling to pull the heavy wooden board back against the gale. The wind was incredibly strong, pushing back against him, coating his face in ice instantly. Maggie was there beside him in a second. She ignored the pain in her side, grabbing the edge of the shutter and pulling with him. Together, Elias roared over the wind. 1, 2, pull. They heaved. The shutter slammed shut. Elias threw the latch, locking it down. They spun away from the window, gasping for breath, the snow melting on their faces. They were standing in the narrow space between the table and the wall, pressed shoulder to shoulder. Elias looked down at her. Her hair had come loose from its pins, tumbling over her shoulders. Her cheeks were flushed from the cold and the exertion. Her eyes were bright and wild. They stood there, breaths mingling in white puffs in the chilly room. The moments stretched. It would have been the easiest thing in the world to reach out, to span the 3 inches between them and pull her against him. Then Maggie stepped back. She bumped into the table, jarring the lamp. "I am sorry," she stammered, putting a hand to her messy hair. "I should have pinned this better." She turned away, her face burning. "I know why you sent for a bride, Elias. I know a man out here needs things, but I am not sure I am what you wanted. I am broken. I am trouble." The words hit Elias like a physical blow. She thought she was a disappointment. She thought she was a transaction that had turned out to be a poor investment. He reached out and caught her wrist. His grip was firm but gentle. "Maggie, look at me." She turned slowly, refusing to meet his eyes. He stepped closer, his voice rough with an emotion he did not know how to name. "Do not ever say that. Do not ever think I look at you and see a debt paid." He struggled for the words. He was a man of silence, and language felt clumsy in his mouth. "I did not send for a worker," he said, "and I did not send for a warmer for my bed. I sent because the silence out here gets so loud it drowns a man. I wanted someone who chose to be here." His voice cracked on the last word. He felt exposed, stripped of his armor. Maggie looked up. She saw the vulnerability in his face, the raw honesty in his dark eyes. She saw that he was just as afraid as she was. Afraid of being rejected, afraid of being alone. "You chose me," she whispered. "You came into the storm for me." "I would do it again," he said. "Tonight, tomorrow, always." The air in the room seemed to shift. The tension of the storm outside faded, replaced by a warm, heavy silence. It was not the awkward silence of strangers anymore. It was the silence of 2 people standing on the edge of a cliff, looking down together. After that night, the walls of the cabin seemed to expand. There was room for both of them now. They talked more freely. Maggie asked about the cattle, about the seasons. She wanted to know how he survived the winters before. But the land outside did not care about their growing bond. Elias rode into Bitter Creek one morning for supplies. The snow had melted enough to make the trip possible, though the mud was thick as molasses. The town felt different. Eyes followed him as he tied Rusty at the rail. 2 men leaning against the saloon wall stopped talking when he passed. At the general store, Mrs. Brody, a widow with a face like a dried plum and a tongue sharp enough to shear sheep, was behind the counter. "Mr. Boone," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness, "we did not expect to see you until the thaw was proper. I hear you have company at your place." "I need flour," Elias said flatly, "and coffee. 5 pounds of sugar." Mrs. Brody weighed the sugar in silence, her lips pursed so tight they disappeared. "It is a miracle the young woman survived," Mrs. Brody said, snapping the twine on the package. "Though some might say it is barely decent. A man and an unmarried woman alone in that cabin for 3 weeks. People talk, Mr. Boone. They worry about the morality of the situation." Elias felt the heat rise up the back of his neck. It was not shame. It was anger. "She was dying, Mrs. Brodie," Elias said, his voice hard. "Was I supposed to leave her in the snow to keep her reputation clean?" Mrs. Brodie sniffed. "You are a bachelor, Mr. Boone. She is, well, nobody knows who she is, do they? A woman who answers an advertisement in a newspaper. It suggests a certain lack of options. One wonders if she is no better than she ought to be." Elias slammed his hand down on the counter. The jar of peppermint sticks rattled. "She is a lady," he growled, "and she is under my protection. Anyone who insults her insults me." He threw a gold coin on the counter, grabbed his supplies, and walked out. The ride back was long. Elias wrestled with the thoughts in his head. They were right. Not about Maggie's character, but about the situation. By keeping her there alone and unmarried, he was ruining her if she ever wanted to leave, to find a husband or a position elsewhere. The stain of this winter would follow her. He was trying to save her life, but he might be destroying her future. When he reached the cabin, Maggie was at the window. She had been watching for him. The sight of her face, pale and anxious, did something to his heart. He unloaded the supplies in silence. Maggie watched him, sensing the change in his mood. "What happened?" she asked. Elias hung up his coat. He did not know how to do this. He had no practice with delicate words. "I heard things in town today," he said, standing by the fire. "People talk. They know you are here. They know we are alone." Maggie's face hardened. She crossed her arms over her chest. "Let him talk. I have done nothing wrong." "I know that," Elias said quickly. "But they are saying it is not right, that a woman staying with a man who is not her kin is improper." He could not finish the sentence. He did not want to repeat the vile words. "I see," Maggie said bitterly. "They think I am a fallen woman because I survived." Elias took a step toward her. "I will not let them speak ill of you. But I cannot stop the whispers, Maggie. Not as long as things are as they are." He took a deep breath. It felt like standing on the edge of a cliff. "There is a way to stop it. A way to protect your name." Maggie looked at him, her eyes narrowing slightly. "What way?" "We can marry," Elias said. The words hung in the air, heavy and blunt. Maggie stared at him. She did not blush. She did not smile. She went very still. "Marry," she repeated. "It was the original arrangement," Elias said, stumbling now, his hands twisting his hat. "You came here to be my wife. If we marry legally in the church, no one can say a word. You will be Mrs. Boone. You will have the protection of my name." Maggie turned away. She walked to the window and looked out at the darkening snow. "Is that what you want, Elias?" she asked quietly. "To protect my name?" "It is the right thing to do," he said. "The right thing," she echoed. She spun around, and her eyes were blazing. "You want to marry me to fix a mess? You want to marry me because you feel responsible, because you pulled me out of the snow and now you are stuck with me." "That is not it," Elias protested. "Is it not?" she demanded. She walked toward him, her voice rising. "Do you think I have not seen this before? Men who think they are doing a woman a favor. Poor Maggie. She has nowhere to go. Let me take her in." "I am not those men," Elias growled. "Then stop sounding like them," she cried. She stopped, her chest heaving. The anger drained out of her, leaving her looking small and tired. I have been a transaction my whole life, Elias, she said, her voice trembling. My father married me off to a clerk when I was 17 to pay a debt. When he died of fever, I was passed around to boarding houses and employers who looked at me like I was a piece of meat on a counter. I answered your letter because I wanted a choice. I wanted to choose my life. She looked at him, tears standing in her eyes. If you marry me out of pity or out of duty or because Mrs. Brodie made you feel ashamed, I will not do it. I would rather walk out into that snow. Elias stared at her. He saw the fierce pride in her, the steel spine that had carried her 2,000 miles. He dropped his hat on the table. He crossed the room and stood in front of her. He did not touch her, but he stood close enough that she had to look up at him. I do not pity you, Margaret, he said. His voice was low and steady. I admire you. You are the strongest person I have ever met. He looked down at his hands, then back at her face. I am a lonely man, he admitted. I have been alone so long I forgot how to speak to people. I forgot what it was like to have a light in this cabin. When I rode into town today, I hated leaving. I hated the miles between us. He took a breath. I am not asking you to marry me to save your reputation. I am asking because I want you here. I want to see you across the table every morning. I want to know you are safe. Maggie searched his face. She saw the honesty there, stripped bare of pretense. She saw the fear in him, too. The fear that she would say no. She wiped a tear from her cheek. If I agree, she said, her voice steadying, I have conditions. Elias nodded. Name them. I will not be a silent partner, she said. I will not be property. If I have a thought, I will speak it. If I want to learn to ride or shoot or manage the books, you will teach me. I am not just a wife to mend your shirts, Elias. I am a partner. Elias smiled. It was a rare, slow expression that transformed his rugged face. I would expect nothing less, he said. And she added, her voice dropping, you will not expect anything from me until I am ready. Elias understood. He remembered the fear in her eyes when she talked about the man in Chicago. I will never force you, Maggie, he said solemnly. I will never touch you unless you want me to. That is a promise on my mother's Bible. Maggie looked at him for a long moment. Then she nodded. All right, she whispered. All right, Elias. I will marry you. 2 days later, they rode into town. The sky was a hard, brilliant blue, the sun dazzling on the melting snow. Maggie wore her best dress from her salvaged trunk, a dark navy wool that she had steamed and pressed. She sat tall in the saddle, though her knuckles were white on the reins. The ceremony was brief. The church was cold, their breath misting in the air. Elias produced a simple band of gold. It had been his grandmother's, but he had polished it until it shone. He took Maggie's hand. Her fingers were cold. He slid the ring onto her finger. With this ring I thee wed, he rumbled. As he spoke, he looked at her, really looked at her. And Maggie looked back. In that dusty, cold church, a current passed between them. It was fear, yes, but it was also a spark, a recognition. We are in this together now. You may kiss the bride, the preacher mumbled. Elias hesitated. He leaned down slowly. Maggie did not pull away. He pressed his lips to her cheek, chaste and quick. When they walked out of the church, a small crowd had gathered. Mrs. Brodie was there watching with narrowed eyes. "Let 'em look," Elias muttered. He helped Maggie onto her horse. "Ready, Mrs. Boone." The name sent a shiver through her. "Ready," she said. Spring arrived in the Wyoming Territory, not with a gentle unfurling of flowers, but with a violent, muddy upheaval. The snow retreated up the slopes of the Absaroka Range, leaving behind a land that was sodden, brown, and waking up hungry. For Elias and Maggie Boone, the change in season marked a shift in their own lives. The claustrophobic intimacy of the winter cabin gave way to the demanding rhythm of the ranch. Maggie proved to be stronger than her slender frame suggested. She discarded her city boots for a pair of rough hide ones Elias had bartered for in town, and she pinned her skirts up to keep them out of the muck. When the calving season hit its peak, she was there in the corral. Mud streaked across her cheek, holding a lantern high while Elias worked to pull a breech calf from a heaving heifer. "Hold it steady, Maggie," Elias grunted, his arm deep inside the animal. "I have got it," she said, her voice calm despite the blood and the steam rising in the cold night air. When the calf finally slid out, wet and blinking, Elias stood back, wiping his brow with his forearm. He looked at his wife. "You did good," Elias said quietly. Most women from back east would have fainted at the smell. Maggie smiled, a small, tired curving of her lips. "I told you, Elias. I am not delicate. I just needed a chance to breathe." They were partners now. It was an unspoken contract, sealed in sweat and shared exhaustion. She learned to ride the mare, learning to sit deep in the saddle and move with the animal rather than bouncing against it. She took over the supply ledger, her neat handwriting turning his chaotic scribbles into an organized inventory. The town of Bitter Creek was slow to change its mind, but it respected grit, and the Boones had grit. When they rode into town for Sunday service, the reception was still chilly, but less hostile than before. Mrs. Brody even offered a stiff nod that was almost respectful. "I wish to say something," Mrs. Brody said one day, cornering Maggie by the church steps. Her voice was tight. "I spoke too freely before. The way you stood by your husband, the way he stood for you, it was decent. I offer an apology. It was not a warm embrace, but in the hard currency of the frontier, it was gold." "Thank you, Mrs. Brody," Maggie said softly. "I accept it." But the peace was not to last. It was a Tuesday afternoon in late April. Elias was at the blacksmith shed getting a new shoe fitted for Rusty. Miller the smith was hammering a piece of red-hot iron, sparks flying in the gloom. "Two strangers rode in yesterday," Miller said without looking up from his work. "Slick fellows, city clothes." Elias stiffened. Strangers were rare. Strangers asking questions were trouble. "What did they want?" Elias asked. "Asked about the wagon wreck." Miller plunged the iron into a bucket of water and steam hissed violently. "Asked if any property had been recovered, and they asked about a woman, Margaret Hale." Elias felt a cold stone drop into his stomach. "What did you tell them?" "Told them I did not know any Hale." Miller grunted, wiping his hands on his leather apron. "Told them a Mrs. Boone lived out your way, though." Elias stared at the smith's back. Miller turned. "They say she took something, Boone. Money, maybe jewelry. Said she robbed a trunk before the snow covered the wreck." Elias felt a flash of white-hot anger, followed immediately by a sick dread. "They are liars," Elias said. "Maybe. But they look like men who know the law, and they are headed your way." Elias did not wait for the horseshoe. He threw a coin on the anvil, mounted Rusty, and rode for the ranch as if the devil were snapping at his heels. He arrived to find 2 horses tied at his hitching rail. They were fine animals, thoroughbreds, not range ponies. He dismounted, loosening the thong on his holster, and walked up the steps. Maggie was standing on the porch. She was pale, her back pressed against the log wall, as if she were trying to merge with the wood. Standing in the yard were 2 men. One was tall and thin with spectacles and a notebook. The other was broader, dressed in a checked suit that was dusty from travel, wearing a bowler hat. He had a face that was soft, but his eyes were hard, shiny beads. Elias stepped onto the porch, placing himself between Maggie and the men. "Get off my land," Elias said. His voice was a low rumble like thunder before a storm. The man in the bowler hat smiled. It was not a pleasant expression. "Mr. Boone, I presume." "I am Mr. Carroll. This is my associate, Mr. Finch. We are here to clarify some legal matters regarding the unfortunate incident at the pass." Carroll. The name hit Elias like a physical blow. This was the landlord, the man who had tried to force himself into her room, the man she had fled. Maggie made a small choked sound behind him. "I know who you are," Elias said, his hand hovering near his gun, "and I know what you are. You have 5 seconds to mount up and ride out before I forget. I am a civilized man." Carroll did not flinch. He reached into his coat pocket. Elias tensed, his hand dropping to his coat, but Carroll only produced a folded paper. "We are not here for violence, Mr. Boone. We are here for justice and for restitution." He unfolded the paper. "We have witness testimony that implies your wife, the former Miss Hale, misappropriated valuables from the wreckage of the wagon train, specifically a carpet bag containing $500 in gold coin and a diamond brooch belonging to the late Mrs. Jensen." "Lies," Elias spat. "Is it?" Carroll looked past Elias at Maggie. His eyes raked over her with a familiar oily possessiveness that made Elias's blood boil. "Tell him, Maggie. Tell him how you paid for your ticket west. Tell him what you grabbed when the wagon went over." Maggie was trembling. Elias could feel the vibration of her fear through the floorboards. "I did not steal," she whispered. Carroll took a step forward. "You were desperate, my dear. You ran from me, from your debts, in the middle of the night. You had nothing. And yet here you are, and the Jensen bag is missing." He looked at Elias. "We are prepared to be reasonable, Mr. Boone. Return the stolen property, and perhaps we can avoid a messy trial. A trial that would, of course, expose Miss Hale's colorful history in Chicago to your neighbors." Elias stepped down the stairs, bringing his face inches from Carroll's. "She is Mrs. Boone," he said, his voice trembling with restrained violence. "And if you say her name again with that filth in your mouth, I will break your jaw." Carroll stepped back, adjusting his cuffs. "Threats will not help you. If the property is not returned, we will file charges. Theft, flight to avoid prosecution. And we will seek damages against you, Mr. Boone, for harboring a fugitive. We will take this land as restitution." He turned to his associate. "Come, Finch. We have business with the territorial judge." They mounted their horses. Carroll looked down at Elias one last time. "You have bought yourself a great deal of trouble, cowboy. I hope she is worth it." They rode out, dust swirling in their wake. Elias stood watching them go until they were out of sight. His heart was hammering against his ribs. He turned slowly to face his wife. Maggie was sitting on the bench by the door, her face buried in her hands. She looked small and broken. Elias walked over to her. He wanted to touch her, to comfort her, but the doubt was a splinter in his mind. "Maggie," he said. She looked up. Her eyes were red-rimmed, swimming with tears. "Did you take it?" he asked. The question hung in the air, heavy and terrible. Maggie let out a sob. She stood up, wringing her hands. "Elias, you have to understand. The wreck. It was chaos. The wagon was tipping. People were screaming. I was thrown against the trunk." She took a breath, her chest heaving. "I grabbed a bag," she confessed. "I thought it was mine. My carpet bag looked just like Mrs. Jensen's, small, floral pattern. In the snow, in the dark, I just grabbed it and crawled." She looked at him, pleading. "I did not open it until I was pinned under the wreckage. I felt the shape of it. It was heavy, too heavy to be my clothes. I realized then." "And then?" Elias asked. "I held on to it," she whispered. "I was going to give it back. I swear, Elias, I was going to find Mrs. Jensen. But then the cold came and the pain, and when you found me, I dropped it. It must be out there still, buried in the mud." She reached out, touching his sleeve. "I did not steal it to come here. I worked 3 jobs to pay for my ticket. I scrubbed floors. I sewed until my fingers bled. I ran from Carol because he would not take no for an answer. But I never stole." Elias looked down at her. He saw the terror in her face. It was the terror of a trapped animal, a creature that has been kicked and hunted its whole life. He looked at her hands. They were rough now, scarred from the ranch work, but they were honest hands. He remembered the way she had looked when he pulled her from the snow, holding nothing but her life. He closed his eyes for a moment, listening to the wind. Then he opened them and took her face in his hands. "I believe you," he said. Maggie collapsed against him, weeping. He held her, stroking her hair, feeling the shuddering sobs rack her body. But believing her was not enough. Carol had the law, or a twisted version of it, on his side, and he had money. "We have a fight coming, Maggie," Elias said into her hair. "A hard one." The days that followed were suffocating. The ranch, once a sanctuary, felt like a prison. Every rider on the horizon made Elias reach for his rifle. Every rustle of the wind sounded like a sheriff's warrant. The threat of losing the land gnawed at Elias. This ranch was his penance. It was the only thing he had built that was clean. To lose it because of a lie made a dark anger simmer in his gut. He withdrew. He stopped talking at dinner. He spent his days riding the far fence line, working until his muscles screamed, trying to exhaust the rage so he would not turn it on the world. Maggie watched him from the window. She saw the way his shoulders slumped, the way the lines around his eyes deepened. She felt the weight of her own guilt crushing her. "He is losing everything because of me." She began to think of leaving. If she ran, if she disappeared into the night, Carol would follow her. He would leave Elias alone. The ranch would be safe. It was a noble thought, but it terrified her. She looked at Elias sitting by the fire, mending a harness in grim silence, and her heart ached. She loved him. She loved the way he looked at the sky in the morning. She loved the rough warmth of his hands. She loved him with a desperation that was almost painful. Walking away from him would be like cutting out her own heart, but staying seemed selfish. One evening, the tension in the cabin finally snapped. It started over something small. Elias had come in late, tracking mud on the floor Maggie had just swept. She made a comment, sharp with stress. he snapped back. "Do not nag me, woman," he growled. "I have enough wolves at the door without you adding to the noise." Maggie froze. The unfairness of it stung her to tears. "I am not nagging," she said. "I am trying to keep this home decent." "Decent," Elias laughed, a harsh, humorless sound. "We are about to be thrown into the street, Maggie. Clean floors will not save us." "Then maybe I should go," Maggie cried. The words rang in the room. Elias slowly turned to face her. The harness dropped from his hands. "What did you say?" he asked softly. "Maybe I should go," Maggie repeated, her voice trembling but gaining strength. "If I leave, Carol follows me. He wants me, Elias. He wants to punish me. If I go, he leaves you the land." She took a step toward the door. "I can pack tonight. I can take the mare. I will ride for the railhead." She expected him to argue logic. She expected him to maybe even agree, to see the practical sense of it. She did not expect him to cross the room in 2 strides and grab her shoulders, shaking her hard. "Stop it," he roared. "You think you can just leave." He was shouting now, his face twisted with an emotion she had never seen there, panic. "You think you can walk out of here and save me?" "It saves the ranch," she cried. "Damn the ranch," Elias yelled. He let her go, stepping back, raking his hands through his hair. He was breathing hard, his chest heaving. "Do you not understand?" he said, his voice cracking. "The land is dirt. It is grass and rocks. I can find more dirt, but I cannot find another you." Maggie stared at him, stunned into silence. He looked at her, his eyes wild and raw. "I killed a man once, Maggie. I watched the light go out of his eyes and part of me died with him. I spent 10 years acting like a ghost, just waiting to fade away." He took a step toward her, his hands shaking. "Then you came. You came out of the snow, and you woke me up. You made me want to be alive again." He reached out and touched her cheek, his fingers trembling against her skin. "If you leave to protect this pile of logs, you will shatter me. I will not survive it, Maggie. I will not survive losing you." The confession hung between them, raw and bleeding. It was not the polite declaration of a husband. It was the desperate plea of a man standing on the edge of an abyss. "Elias," she whispered. She saw it then. It was not obligation. It was not pity. It was love. Deep, terrified, overwhelming love. She made a small sound and threw herself at him. He caught her, lifting her off her feet, burying his face in her neck. "Do not leave me," he choked out. "Never," she promised, sobbing. "Never." They clung to each other as if the floor were falling away beneath them. The fear of the past weeks, the anger, the doubt, it all transmuted into a frantic, blinding need. Elias found her mouth. He kissed her, not with the gentle restraint of their wedding night, but with a starving intensity. Maggie kissed him back, her hands tangling in his hair, pulling him closer, wanting to merge with him so completely that no lawman or landlord could ever pry them apart. He carried her to the bed, stumbling a little, never breaking the kiss. They fell onto the quilt together. But then Elias stopped. He pulled back, gasping, his pupils blown wide. He looked at her with a heat that scorched her skin. He moved his hand to the buttons of her bodice. His fingers shook. Then a shadow passed over his face. He stopped. "No," he groaned. He rolled off her, landing on his back on the mattress, staring up at the ceiling. "Elias," Maggie whispered, confused. "We cannot," he rasped. He turned his head to look at her. His eyes were full of regret, but his jaw was set. Not like this, Maggie. Not while he is out there. Not while they are calling you a thief and threatening to tear us apart. He reached out and took her hand, bringing it to his lips. When I take you, he said fiercely, it will be because we are free. It will be a celebration, not a desperate escape. I will not let Carol stain this too. Maggie looked at him. She understood. He wanted their union to be pure, untouched by the fear that was hunting them. She moved closer, curling her body against his side. She rested her head on his shoulder. You are a stubborn man, Elias Boone, she whispered. He wrapped his arm around her, pulling the quilt up over them both. We wait, he said. We fight them. We win. And then he left the sentence unfinished, but the promise in his voice made her shiver. 2 days later, the summons arrived. The wooden steps of the Bitter Creek courthouse groaned under the weight of the gathering crowd. It was a Tuesday, usually a day for quiet commerce and saloon idling. But today the dusty street was alive with a tension that hummed like a telegraph wire. The town had turned out not for justice, but for theater. Elias rode Rusty to the hitching rail, Maggie's mare close beside him. He dismounted and moved to help her down, his body blocking the view of the loafers leaning against the general store. When Maggie's boots touched the dirt, he did not let go of her hand. Keep your head up, he said, his voice a low rumble meant only for her. You have done nothing to be ashamed of. Maggie nodded, though her throat felt constricted as if a rope were already tightening there. Look at her, a woman whispered, loud enough to be heard. Acts like a lady, but we heard the stories. She ran off with a rancher's money, another voice muttered. Elias stiffened, his jaw tightening into a line of white granite. He walked Maggie toward the double doors of the courthouse, his stride heavy and deliberate. The crowd parted, not out of respect, but out of a primal instinct to avoid the dangerous energy radiating from the big rancher. Inside, the air was stagnant, smelling of old tobacco, sweat, and floor wax. Judge Holloway sat behind a scarred oak desk on a raised platform. He was a man carved from the same rough timber as the territory itself, gray-haired, heavy-lidded, with eyes that had seen every variety of frontier lie. Carroll and his associate Finch were already seated at the plaintiff's table. Carroll looked impeccable in a fresh suit, his bowler hat resting on the table like a trophy. He turned as they entered, offering a small, pitying smile that made Maggie's stomach turn over. Elias guided Maggie to the defendant's bench. He sat beside her, his hat on his knee, his presence a solid wall against the room. Judge Holloway banged a wooden gavel. The sound cracked like a pistol shot, silencing the murmurs in the gallery. This hearing is in session. We are here to determine the validity of the claim brought by Mr. Carroll regarding the theft of property from the wagon train wreckage at Granite Pass. Mr. Carroll, state your case. Carroll stood up. He buttoned his jacket with slow, practiced movements. Your Honor, he began, gesturing toward Maggie, we do not wish to be harsh. We understand that the wilderness drives people to desperation. Miss Hale, pardon me, Mrs. Boone was in a difficult position. She had fled her obligations in Chicago. She was alone. When the wagon wrecked, she saw an opportunity. He paced the floor, acting the part of the reluctant accuser. A carpet bag belonging to Mrs. Jensen, containing $500 in gold and jewelry, went missing. Mrs. Boone admits to being at the scene. She admits to taking a bag. We submit that she did not take it by accident, but by design. He turned to the crowd, spreading his hands. Is it not natural? A destitute woman, frightened, seizing a lifeline. We only ask for the return of the property. We ask for justice for the late Mrs. Jensen's family. The courtroom murmured in agreement. It was a good story. It made sense to them. Mrs. Boone, the judge said, turning his gaze on her. Take the stand. Maggie stood up. Her legs felt like water. She walked to the witness chair and sat down, placing her hands in her lap to hide their trembling. Tell us what happened, the judge said. Maggie took a breath. She looked at Elias. He gave her a barely perceptible nod. It was snowing, she began. Her voice was barely a whisper. Speak up, the judge commanded. It was snowing, she said, louder, though her voice shook. The wind was screaming. The lead wagon slipped. I heard the driver shout, and then the world turned over. She closed her eyes, the memory assaulting her. I was thrown. I hit the ground hard. There was wood splintering, horses screaming. It was dark and cold. Your Honor, I crawled through the snow. I could not feel my feet. I saw a trunk smashed open. I saw a bag. She opened her eyes, looking directly at the judge. My bag was a floral carpet bag. The one on the ground looked the same. I grabbed it. I did not check inside. I just wanted something to hold on to. I wanted to know I was still me. And when did you realize it was not yours? Carol asked, stepping forward. Maggie flinched. Later. When I was pinned, I felt the weight of it, and yet, Carol said, his voice sharpening, you did not give it to the station master when you were rescued. You did not mention it to Mr. Boone. I was dying, Maggie cried. I was frozen. I do not remember everything. I dropped it in the mud when Elias pulled me out. Convenient, Carol sneered. You dropped the gold, but you kept your life. Objection, Elias growled, half rising from his seat. Sit down, Mr. Boone, the judge warned. Carol smiled. He turned back to Maggie. Let us speak of your character, Mrs. Boone. You say you are an honest woman, yet in Chicago you lived alone. You had no family. You were dismissed from your employment after an altercation with a gentleman. I was defending myself, Maggie said, her face flushing hot. He tried to touch me. Carol raised an eyebrow. So you say. But a pattern emerges, does it not? A woman alone. A woman who misunderstands the intentions of men. A woman who takes what she thinks she is owed. He leaned in close to the witness stand. The smell of his cologne, expensive and cloying, made Maggie gag. You used Mr. Boone to get a roof over your head, he said softly. Why should we believe you did not use Mrs. Jensen's gold to get a ticket? I did not, Maggie insisted, tears spilling over. The crowd whispered louder. She is crying. Guilty tears. Elias could not take it any more. He stood up, ignoring the judge's gavel. Your Honor, he bellowed. The room went silent. Elias walked to the center of the floor. He held his hat in his hands, crushing the brim. I am not a lawyer, Elias said, his voice shaking with suppressed rage. I do not have fancy words, but I know this woman. Mr. Boone, you are out of order, the judge said, though he did not bang the gavel again. Let me speak, Elias said. He turned to the crowd. You all know me. You know I live quiet. You know I keep to myself. You know about the scar on my face. He touched the jagged white line on his jaw. 10 years ago I killed a man in a fair fight in Kansas. I have lived with that ghost every day. I get letters from his brother promising to put a bullet in my back. I am a man with blood on his hands." The crowd stared. They knew the rumors, but to hear him say it, to hear him admit to the darkness, was different. "I know what guilt looks like," Elias said. "I see it in the mirror every morning, and I know what innocence looks like." He pointed at Maggie. "That woman walked through hell to get here. She fought storms and starvation. She did not do it for gold. She did it because she has a heart that is too big for this small, mean world. She is my wife, and she is the most honest thing in this room." He turned to Carol. "You want to talk about character. You are a man who hunts a woman across 3 states for a bag of coins. That tells me all I need to know about your character." There was a silence in the courtroom. A heavy, thoughtful silence. Then the back door swung open. A man walked in. He was old, dressed in buckskins that had seen better decades, with long gray hair and a face like a dried apple. It was the trail scout Elias had met in the saloon months ago. "I have something to say," the scout rasped. Judge Holloway peered over his spectacles. "Identify yourself." "Name is Jim, just Jim. I was out at the pass 3 days after the wreck, before the snow melted." He walked to the front, ignoring Carol's attempts to block him. "I found this." Jim pulled a small object from his pocket and tossed it onto the judge's desk. It was a silver pocket watch. "Found it half a mile down the draw," Jim said, "along with a lady's hat and a busted violin." "What is your point?" Carol snapped. "Point is," Jim said, turning to look at the city man with contempt, "the wreckage was scattered for miles. Coyotes dragged things. Wind blew things. And there were tracks." "Tracks?" the judge asked. "Shod horses," Jim said. "Not mustangs. 2 riders picked through the site before Mr. Boone ever got there. Looted the easy stuff." He looked at Carol. "Maybe the lady did not take your bag, mister. Maybe someone else beat you to it. Or maybe you just want to pin it on her because she is an easy target." Carol's face turned a mottled red. "This is hearsay. This is a senile old man." Jim spat on the floor. "I track better than you lie, son." The judge looked at the watch, then at Carol. "It seems there is significant doubt as to the chain of events," Judge Holloway said. Carol slammed his hand on the table. "She owed me," he shouted, his composure shattering like glass. The room gasped. "She lived in my building," Carol yelled, pointing a shaking finger at Maggie. "I gave her everything. I offered her a position. I offered her comfort, and she spat in my face and ran away like a thief. She owes me that money for the trouble she caused." Maggie shrank back in the chair. The truth was out. It was not about the gold. It was about ownership. Judge Holloway's eyes narrowed. "So," the judge said, his voice dangerously quiet, "this is a personal grievance, Mr. Carroll." "It is justice," Carol seethed. "She belongs to me. Her debt belongs to me." The judge banged the gavel. "Recess. I will review the evidence. 15 minutes." The courtroom exploded into noise. Elias moved instantly to the witness stand, placing himself between Maggie and the room. "Come on," he said gently. "Let us get some air." He led her out the side door into the alley beside the courthouse. The air was cooler there in the shade. But Maggie was shaking so hard she could barely stand. "He hates me," she whispered. "He will never stop." "He is finished," Elias said. He showed his hand. The judge saw it. Suddenly the door behind them banged open. Carol burst out, followed by Finch. Carol's face was twisted in a mask of fury. "You think you won?" Carol hissed. He marched toward them. Elias stepped in front of Maggie, his hands loose at his sides. "Back off, Carol," Elias warned. Carol ignored him. He lunged, reaching around Elias to grab Maggie's arm. "You are coming with me, you little ingrate," Carol snarled. "I will drag you back to Chicago in irons if I have to." Maggie screamed. Elias did not think. He moved. He shoved Carol back, a hard, open-handed strike to the chest that sent the man stumbling into the dust. Carol scrambled up, his hand going inside his coat. "He has a gun," someone shouted from the street. Elias's hand blurred. In a heartbeat his Colt was drawn, the hammer cocked, the barrel leveled at Carol's chest. "Do not," Elias said. The word was flat, final. Carol froze, his hand half withdrawn from his coat, gripping the pearl handle of a small pistol. He looked into the barrel of Elias's gun, and then he looked into Elias's eyes. He saw death there. He saw a man who had killed before and would do it again without hesitation to protect what was his. "Drop it," Elias commanded. The alley was silent. The crowd from the courthouse had spilled out, watching in terrified fascination. Judge Holloway stood on the steps, witnessing it all. Carol's hand trembled. Slowly, very slowly, he pulled the pistol out by 2 fingers and dropped it in the dirt. Elias did not lower his gun. "Get on your horse," Elias said. "Ride east. If I see you in this territory again, I will not ask you to leave." Carol looked at the judge, then at the crowd. He saw no sympathy. He saw only the hard, unforgiving face of the frontier. He spat on the ground, turned, and walked to his horse. Finch followed, looking pale and sick. Judge Holloway walked down the steps. He looked at Carol riding away, then at Elias, who was slowly uncocking his revolver and holstering it. "Mr. Boone," the judge said. "Your Honor," Elias said, touching his hat. The judge looked at Maggie, who was clinging to Elias's arm, pale as a sheet. "Case dismissed," the judge said loudly, so the whole town could hear. "Insufficient evidence of theft. The disputed assets, if found, will be auctioned for the county poor fund." He looked at Elias. "Mr. Boone, you showed restraint today. Keep it that way." "Yes, sir." The crowd began to disperse. They looked at Maggie differently now, not with judgment, but with a grudging respect. She had stood up. Her husband had drawn iron for her. In the West, that meant something. They rode out of town in silence as the adrenaline faded. The sky began to darken as they reached the halfway point. The unseasonable heat had bred a monster. Clouds the color of bruised plums boiled up over the mountains, moving with terrifying speed. "Storm!" Elias shouted over the rising wind. "We will not make the ranch!" Thunder cracked, shaking the ground. Rain began to fall, not in drops but in sheets. "The lion shack," Elias yelled, pointing to a small leaning structure near the creek bed. They kicked their horses into a gallop. Lightning stitched the sky in blinding white forks. They reached the shack just as the heavens opened fully. Elias shoved the door open, and they ducked inside. It was tiny, smelling of dry rot and old hay. There was a single rough pallet in the corner and a broken chair. Elias lit the lantern he carried in his saddlebag. The flame flickered, casting long dancing shadows. Maggie stood in the center of the room, shivering. Her dress was soaked, plastering to her skin. Her hair had come loose, hanging in wet ropes around her face. She looked at Elias. He was watching her, his face unreadable in the dim light. "Are you all right?" he asked. "No," she said. The word broke out of her. She wrapped her arms around herself. You heard him. You heard what he said. That I am a user. That I am damaged goods. Maggie, Elias started stepping forward. Do not, she cried, backing away. Do not look at me with pity, Elias. I cannot bear it. I saw your face in the courtroom. You had to stand there and listen to him list every shame I have ever had. You had to admit to a murder to save me. She sank down onto the pallet, burying her face in her hands. I am dirty, Elias. I am trouble. You should have let him take me. You would be better off. The silence that followed was heavy, filled only by the drumming of the rain. Then she heard his boots on the floorboards. He knelt in front of her. He took her hands and pulled them away from her face. Look at me, he commanded. She opened her eyes. Elias was not looking at her with pity. He was looking at her with a fierce, burning intensity that took her breath away. I did not see a dirty woman today, he said, his voice rough. I saw a woman who stood before a judge and told the truth while a snake tried to strangle her. I saw a woman who has carried the weight of the world without breaking. He reached up and touched the wet hair at her temple. You think I care about what Carol said. You think I care about your past. I care, she sobbed. I wanted to be new for you. I wanted to be worthy. Worthy, Elias let out a short, incredulous laugh. Maggie, look at me. Look at this scar. Look at these hands. I have killed. I have sinned. If anyone is unworthy in this room, it is me. He leaned closer, his forehead resting against hers. But today, when I stood between you and him, I felt clean for the first time in 10 years. I felt clean because I was fighting for you. He pulled back slightly to look into her eyes. If the whole territory turned against you, Maggie, if every person in this world called you a thief, I would still choose you. I would choose you every time. I would burn the world down to keep you warm. Maggie stared at him. The truth of his words washed over her, hotter than the shame, stronger than the fear. He saw her, all of her, and he stayed. The dam inside her broke. Elias, she whispered. She reached for him. This time there was no hesitation, no fear of the past, no shadow of Carol. There was only the storm outside and the fire inside. Elias groaned as her arms went around his neck. He pulled her to him, his mouth finding hers. The kiss was not gentle. It was urgent and desperate. A reclaiming of souls. When they finally pulled apart, gasping for air, Elias looked into her eyes. I love you, Maggie Boone, he whispered. It was the first time he had said the words aloud. Maggie smiled, pressing her face into the curve of his neck. I love you, Elias. Outside, the storm raged, but inside that small circle of warmth, two people who had been broken and judged had found each other, and nothing would ever tear them apart again. The paper from Judge Holloway, stamped with the official seal of the territory, was tucked away in the bottom drawer of the dresser. It was a victory, certainly, but out here, where the wind scoured the earth and the sky stretched wide enough to swallow a man whole, a piece of paper offered little protection against the realities of life. Summer arrived, turning the plains into a sea of golden grass that rippled under the wind. The days were long and hot, the sun bleaching the wood of the cabin to a silvery gray. The marriage of Elias and Maggie Boone deepened like a river cutting a canyon. It was no longer the desperate clinging need of the storm or the defiant stand of the courtroom. It was a steady, daily rhythm. Maggie's sewing business grew. She put up a small notice on the community board in town. Sewing, mending, and alterations. Reasonable rates. M. Boone. At first it was just the blacksmith's wife needing a dress let out. Then it was the banker's wife needing a coat relined. Maggie's stitches were tiny and precise, a skill honed in the sweatshops of Chicago, but now applied for her own gain. She sat on the porch of the ranch house in the afternoons, a basket of fabric at her feet, the needle flashing in the sun. Elias would watch her from the corral. He saw the pride in her face when she handed him a small stack of coins at the end of the month. "For the winter feed," she said, placing the money in his hand. "You earned this, Maggie," Elias said. "Keep it. Buy yourself something nice." She shook her head, closing his fingers over the coins. "We are partners, Elias. The feed is for the herd. The herd is for us." He looked at the coins, then at her. He realized then that she was healing a part of him he did not know was broken. She was teaching him that he did not have to carry the entire world on his shoulders alone. It was Reverend Thomas who brought the news. He rode out to the ranch on a mule that looked older than the hills, carrying a Bible and a grim expression. They sat on the porch drinking lemonade that Maggie had made with the last of the sugar. "There's something you folks ought to know," the Reverend said, wiping his brow with a handkerchief. "About the wreck." Elias tensed. "Is Carol back?" "No, nothing like that," the Reverend said. "It is about survivors. We thought Mrs. Boone was the only one, but word came down from the homesteaders over in Red Rock." He took a sip of lemonade. "A boy was found wandering near the creek bed about 5 miles east of the crash site. Must have been thrown clear and walked in the wrong direction." Maggie's hand flew to her mouth. "A boy. 6 years old," the Reverend said. "Name is Caleb. The Millers, those homesteaders out that way, they took him in temporary, but they have 7 of their own and barely enough corn to feed them. The boy is quiet. Has not said a word since they found him." Maggie looked at Elias. Her eyes were wide, swimming with a sudden fierce emotion. She remembered the chaos of that night, the screaming. "He was there," she whispered. "He was in the dark, just like me." Elias felt a knot of fear in his stomach. A child, a boy who had seen death. He looked at his own hands, hands that knew how to work and how to fight, but knew nothing of comforting a child. "Maggie," he said warningly. "We have to go see him," she said. Elias sighed. "Maggie, he survived." "Elias," she said, her voice rising. "He is alone. He thinks the world has ended. I know that feeling. I sat in that snow and thought nobody was coming." She reached out and took Elias's hand. "We have plenty of room, Elias. We have food." "It is not about food," Elias said quietly. "It is about, I am not a father, Maggie. I am a man with a scar and a bad reputation. What can I give a boy?" "You can give him what you gave me," she said simply. "A chance to breathe." 2 days later they hitched the wagon and rode to Red Rock. The Miller homestead was a chaotic collection of sod structures and shouting children. Mrs. Miller, a harried woman with a baby on her hip, pointed them toward the barn. "He stays in there mostly," she said, looking tired. "He hides in the hayloft. Does not eat much. We try, folks, but he is like a wild thing." Maggie climbed the ladder to the loft first. Elias waited at the bottom, feeling large and clumsy in the dim light. "Caleb." Maggie's voice was soft, a gentle melody in the dusty air. There was a rustle in the straw. A small face peered out from behind a stack of hay bales. The boy was thin, his eyes huge and dark. dominating his pale face. He looked like a cornered rabbit. Maggie did not rush him. She sat down on the floor, spreading her skirts. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small object. It was a toy horse she had sewn from scraps of leather and wool stuffed with dried grass. "Hello, Caleb," she said. "My name is Maggie. I was on the wagons too." The boy did not move, but his eyes locked onto the toy horse. "I was scared," Maggie said. "It was very cold. But a man came and found me, a big man with a kind voice." She glanced down through the trapdoor at Elias. Elias looked up, his heart hammering. "He is down there," Maggie said to the boy. "He is very strong, and he knows everything about horses." She set the toy on the floor and slid it forward. Caleb watched it. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, he crawled out from the hay. He reached out a dirty hand and snatched the horse, pulling it to his chest. He looked at Maggie. He did not smile, but the terror in his eyes receded just a fraction. They stayed for an hour. Elias eventually came up. He did not say much. He just sat on a bale and whittled a piece of pine. Caleb watched him. When Elias finished, he handed the boy a small, smooth whistle. "Blow on that if you get scared," Elias said, his voice deep and grave. "It scares the wolves away." When they left, they did not take the boy. It was too soon, and the legalities were messy. But as they drove away, Maggie looked back at the barn. "He needs us," she said. Elias looked at the road ahead. He felt a strange weight in his chest, but it was not the heavy stone of guilt. It was the weight of possibility. "He held on to the whistle, Maggie," Elias said. "He held it tight. It was a seed planted in the dry earth. They did not know if it would grow, but the hope of it lay between them, unspoken and fragile." They shared the evenings on the porch now. Elias would smoke a pipe, the smoke drifting up to mingle with the scent of sage. Maggie would sit on the bench beside him, her head resting on his shoulder. His arm would come around her waist, pulling her close. One night, as the stars came out impossibly bright against the velvet blackness, Maggie spoke. "Do you think they ever go away?" she whispered. "The ghosts." "I do not know," Elias admitted. "I still see the face of that boy in Kansas sometimes. I wonder if I will always be the man who killed him." Maggie turned in his arms, her hand coming up to touch his face in the darkness. Her fingers traced the line of his jaw, the scar that marked him. "You are not that man," she said fiercely. "You used your strength to save me, Elias. You used your gun to protect me. Violence is a tool in your hands. It is a shield, not a weapon." Elias closed his eyes, leaning into her touch. She absolved him in a way no priest ever could. She knew the worst of him, and she loved him anyway. Outside, the Wild West remained harsh. The coyotes howled in the distance. The wind rattled the loose shingles on the roof. The future was unwritten, full of droughts and blizzards and hard years. But inside that small circle of warmth, the light spilled out onto the dark, rugged land. Two people, once broken and judged, had built a fortress that no storm could shatter. They would bring Caleb home when the time was right. They would raise him with strong hands and gentle hearts. They would teach him that the past does not have to define the future. And on quiet nights when the fire burned low and the wind sang its lonely song across the plains, Elias would look at his wife across the table and know with absolute certainty that riding into that blizzard was the best decision he had ever made. Because sometimes the greatest treasures are found in the coldest places, and sometimes the people who feel the most broken are exactly the ones who can put each other back together. Maggie reached across the table and took his hand. "I love you, Elias Boone," she said. "I love you too, Maggie," he replied. "More than all the grass on these plains, more than all the stars in this sky." She smiled, that small, tired curving of her lips that he had come to love more than anything in this world. And outside, the wind that had once tried to kill them now sang a different song. It sang of second chances. It sang of redemption. It sang of a love that was stronger than any storm.